Is how you eat more important than what you eat? On today's episode of the podcast, we're going to answer that question with our guest, Danielle Binns. Welcome back to Feeding the Family with Dr. Kristin. I'm your host, Kristin Saxena. As parents, a lot of us feel like what we feed our kids is super important. The messaging that we get from the doctor's office, from the internet, is all about information on what we should be feeding our kids. And it can be very stressful. It took me a long time to realize that it actually is more important that we focus on the approach or the way or the how of how we feed ourselves and our family than the what we feed ourselves and our family. And on today's episode, we're going to explore that topic even more with our guest, Danielle Binns. All right, well, thanks for coming on the show, Danielle.
Thanks so much, Kristin. Great to be here.
So you are a certified nutritional practitioner. You are a mom of 3 girls.
Yeah.
And you now devote yourself professionally to helping families, coaching families through the trials and tribulations of feeding kids, as well as wellness for adults. Is that correct?
Yes. So it's actually an interesting mix. I came from the corporate space. I came from working in marketing for a number of companies. So I actually do some corporate wellness stuff, but then I do family nutrition and picky eating. So it's all the things to keep me busy enough on top of 3 kids.
Yeah, that seems like plenty. Well, so I think I really wanted to start on this show. We really wanted to talk about the idea that I've talked about in other shows, this idea that how you eat and how you feed your family is even more important than what you eat or what you feed your family. And I think that in some ways that seems like a simple concept, but in other ways it's kind of a lot to unpack in terms of it's not the way that we always approach feeding ourselves or feeding our family. I thought a great place to start might be, I know a little bit about your story and your story with your daughter. And maybe if you could share a little bit how you kind of came to these conclusions or how you kind of came to some of the strategies you use with your families through your personal journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So for everybody, it's a longer story, but I'll try to kind of condense it. So I was actually in nutrition school. I was studying studying fertility because I had PCOS at the time. PCOS, so polycystic ovarian syndrome, for those who don't know. And so I was in school to help myself and ended up getting pregnant. So I was like,
it was working.
Yeah, exactly. But then when I had so my first pregnancy was, it was so blissful. I hadn't gained a bunch of weight, so I felt very comfortable. And then I soon realized why I hadn't gained a bunch of weight. And it's because she was super tiny. So I ended up being induced because she wasn't gaining and her percentiles were dropping. So when she was born, we had a ton of struggles with feeding, or like nursing and feeding. And I was like, okay, I know nursing can be difficult. So once she starts solids, it's going to be all good. Mm-hmm. But through that process, we discovered that she also had a congenital heart condition. So a hole in her heart that needed to be repaired. So we thought, okay, when she has her heart surgery, she's going to eat better. Mm-hmm. Well, when she had her heart surgery, it did not change anything. When she started solids, things got worse. And so we kept waiting for that next thing that was like, okay, this is when things are going to change. And even our pediatrician, was trying to console us and give us some peace of mind that she's just on her own growth curve. She was actually below the 0 percentile, Kristin. Mm-hmm. So as a mom, when you've got that motherly instinct, you're like, something doesn't quite feel right here. And so we started to push for genetic testing and so on, and then discovered that she had another congenital condition, which influences appetite for a lot of kids. So I ended up going to school to study children's eating. And what I learned, as a nutritionist, I knew what to feed her, mm-hmm. right? Kind of know, being, a health advocate like yourself, we know to put the rainbow fruits and veggies and healthy fats and proteins in front of them. But if they're not going to eat it, we're no further ahead. So with my daughter, I focused so much, I stressed myself out on trying to get her to eat and was doing all the tricks. And I was exhausted. I mean, like sweating by the end of a mealtime. That once I started studying picky eating, speaking to experts around the world and reading loads of books, over the year, I put her on a program. My husband and I said, okay, what we're doing is not working. Let's try something else. And when we did, we noticed almost immediate changes. She would start to tell us she was hungry for the first time. So for a kid like ours, that was a really unique scenario.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't have much of an appetite. She started to try new foods. She was even gaining weight. And that is when our pediatrician, our endocrinologist, and even the dietitian were taking notes, asking me what I was doing differently. And so that's, perfect segue to the topic today, which is focusing on the how. I focused way too much on the what initially. And so I know that we'll get into that.
Yeah. I mean, I think you touched on so many topics that are just like near and dear to my heart. A lot of the things that you said, number one, having that sort of like parental instinct where you're getting these answers, but it's just not, and you're getting these strategies to use, and it's just not fitting, or it just doesn't seem to be helping. And you get this sort of sense like something's wrong, or something else is going on. And I think that idea that a lot of times as parents, sometimes we don't trust that instinct. And that's something, I've reinforced with a lot of families too. Like even with the strategies that I will kind of help people out with, at some point it's sort of like, if there is always these possibilities that other things are going on. And so if you're trying these things and you're still getting the sense, I really feel like there's something else, keep pursuing it, which you did, which I think really speaks to that. The other thing, like you said, being a nutritionist, or how I felt sort of within the realm of medicine, you learn a lot about facts in terms of, what are the nutrients that you need to grow and develop well? What does a balanced diet look like? And I think that's all very useful knowledge, and it's very important to know. But at the same time, that's a lot the what of eating. What we fail to, what I think a lot of in the professional realm that people fail to address is that how. And so that's why we see this disconnect where it's like we're giving people the information about the what, but it's not translating into any help for families or help for people to eat better, because we've ignored the how. And so, yes, I would love to segue into this topic where, you kind of in your own personal experience have realized like, wow, we really need to focus on the how. And I love that story about you saying, even the doctors and the dietitian are taking notes, because it's just sort of this paradigm shift about how are we going to look at this and address this in the first place. So tell me a little bit about your opinion. Like, how did you come to this conclusion, and what did that mean to you?
It was, I think it was partly just there was so much trial and error with everything we were doing to try and get her to eat, that you just have to at some point say, okay, I'm at point A and I need to get point B. If I keep doing the same things over and over again, we're going to stay where we are. So we had to sit down and I shared with my husband the research that I had come across and put together this plan. And we, part of it too was also knowing through my research that children actually have this incredible ability to self-regulate if we allow them to, especially in their younger years. Unlike adults, last night I was watching Netflix, which doesn't happen very often, but it was our first day back to school. And so it was a crazy day. And I just needed to decompress at the end of the night. And I noticed that when I sit on the couch, I need to have popcorn. Right now, there's worse things I could be eating, but it's like this trick. It's when I'm eating popcorn, I'm not even noticing. Before I know it, the bowl's empty. Right. And so as adults, we eat, or even children at a certain age, we eat not because out of hunger, but out of just trigger. And so with kids, they actually will stop eating when they're full at a younger age, right? When we're talking about the first few years, they will eat more protein when they need it. It's interesting because you actually don't see kids eat balanced meals very often. And that's for a reason, because they're typically eating based on what they need until we start to influence. And that 85% of parents control their child's intake of food. So that then takes this magic of self-regulation when it comes to food, and we kind of steal it from them a little bit too early.
Totally.
So I knew that. And then I'm sure have also seen, this obesity epidemic with kids, and eating disorders amongst kids, and anxiety and all of that. And I just did not I could tell my daughter was stressed at every meal. And I did not want to be the reason. I didn't want to fuel that for her. I didn't want her to be one of those people that grows up and still has eating issues when they're older because of how they were fed.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, to answer your question, it was out of fear and just necessity that we needed to change the direction that we took. And so why the how? Well, again, it's when parents reach out to me, most of the time the question is, I want my child to be eating more vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
They're not eating enough protein. How do I get them to take a bite of something? Right? And so it was all about eating.
Yeah.
But eating is actually the last step. So if we think about kind of raising adventurous eaters being a staircase, there are up to 42 steps that a child needs to take with each food in order to feel good enough to take that last step and get to the top of the staircase. Now, some foods like a cookie or ice cream for some kids,
it's like one step.
Yeah, it's one step, but it's actually not. It's they know that they can do the other steps.
Mm-hmm.
So when they lack confidence in some of these mini steps, then it shuts down the process. Right? They reject it, and they make it clear to us, I'm not eating this food until I'm 10. I don't eat green foods. Veggies are grown-up foods, right? So they say these things to make sure that we hear them loud and clear. It's because they don't feel comfortable taking that next step. So when I talk about the how, and you hit the nail on the head in the beginning, Kristin, is that the how is it's how we're talking about food. How are we serving food? How are we approaching meal times? How are we expressing our own relationship with food?
Mm-hmm.
All of those pieces are more important than the food we put on the table.
Yeah, I loved how you talked about, just this idea of really in the end, at the moment, it seems so urgent that we say, like, I feel like my kid isn't eating enough vegetables. I feel like my child doesn't eat enough protein. And it causes that worry and that care causes us to like create these interventions. But it's really a very short, it feels long term, because I always say, like, when you're in the moment, it feels like this is the way things are going to be forever. But instead, I think sometimes thinking of, feeding your child is really an 18-year plus job, right? So what's happening today or what's happening tomorrow isn't usually as urgent as saying, like, what is the long-term effects of the things that I'm doing? And I feel like that sort of mindset shift, like you mentioned, these ideas that when I'm sitting on the couch watching Netflix and all of a sudden I accidentally finish a bowl of popcorn without even realizing it, when you start to think about those things, it becomes a little bit easier to go, oh, I can see how when I'm, putting my like an iPad in front of my child so that she'll be distracted long enough to sit and eat the 2 bites of broccoli I really want her to eat. I can see how that maybe translates to an adult who's gotten into the habit of, like you said, like ignoring those cues of internal regulation, internal hunger, fullness, ignoring those body's cues that are telling me, like, hey, my body needs more protein, maybe not more starches today or whatever it is. We're creating habits out of a place of love and concern for our child that in the long term really translate, unfortunately, to like what you're saying, these habits that are creating situations like disordered eating, and they're creating situations like obesity because we're controlling their eating with efforts to control what they're eating today, whether that be like, you need to finish your plate, 2 more bites. Those are all messages that are reinforcing this idea that I should ignore the cues that my body's giving me. And so I think that shift, once I was able, because same for me, I the same thing, I was very interested in nutrition and food as a doctor, and I was always getting questions from families at the same time as I was kind of starting my own young family. And you start to realize, like, these things, this knowledge that I have about nutrition doesn't translate to real life. And then when you start to, like, same as you, I started to do a lot more studying into how do children eat. And when you start to realize, like, gosh, we're kind of born with this internal sense of what we need. And just like you said, the research will show that in general, kids will eat what they need, and they will not eat more than they need, and they will select what they need for their growth and nutrition at that time. But it doesn't always look like, the fancy picture of the plate that we give you at the pediatrician that says, it should be half a cup of this and a fourth a cup of this. Well, that's not how your kid's going to eat every day. But unfortunately, I feel like a lot of the messaging that we get as parents makes us believe, well, that's how my kid should be eating. And, you can look on the internet and you can find tons of recipes and all kinds of information about what your kid can be eating. But in the end, you start to realize that what you really want to raise is a mindful, intuitive eater who has a good relationship with food and their body. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, they got the fourth cup of vegetables that they were supposed to be every day of their life. And in fact, you start to be like, oh, by trying so hard to make that happen, I've actually created situations where I've caused this natural process to be disrupted because I've reinforced or taught them to ignore what their body was naturally telling them, which for me was like mind blowing.
Yeah, absolutely. We sometimes don't see it though, right, Kristin? Because we're so in it, and parents, because I do so much work, especially on the employee wellness side now, I'm seeing all this research that people are not only stressed out but burnt out, and particularly parents, working parents. So when we come home from work, or if we're working from home, and trying to get dinner on the table, and then we get the pushback, and we snap into this, we take a reactive approach, right? Our response is to the meltdowns over what's been served, or the fact that they're hungry and they just want a snack, or asking for alternatives, and we're exhausted. And so our approach isn't, something that's maybe productive to raising better eaters, but this is kind of the world we're in. And sometimes parents just don't have the strategies or know what to do because they're just in survival mode half the time. So what I tell parents is I try to keep things really simple, because if there's a list, like my protocol is like 6 weeks long, right? And it's about 13 steps. And so I'm all about breaking it down, right? Because with anything, I've done a lot of research on habit changing as well. And if we just give parents like one little thing that they can do, and then they see the success in that, they feel a sense of achievement and accomplishment. They're like, okay, I could do that.
Totally.
Now let's do the next, what's the next thing I can take on? And so parents just, if, we tell them, okay, you just got to focus on the how. It's like, well, what do you mean? It's like drinking from a fire hose, because they don't actually, that means it feels overwhelming. And so then they shut down. But if we just say something as simple as, start with just smiling at meal times. Right?
I love that.
Well, just think about how often we smile. So we have a big mirror over our kitchen table, or at least we used to. We've since moved, but I remember seeing my reflection when we were going through all of these dreadful meal times, and I looked miserable. I looked like,
and kids pick up on that.
They do.
Yeah.
And actually, right from a young age, the research shows that even an infant who is being nursed by their mother, if the mother is feeling stressed or anxious, the infant's heart rate increases. They have that uncanny ability to kind of, they feel part of us, and they respond to what our emotions are. So yeah, to your point, they sense that mom and dad are, discontent or frustrated. And so why would any kid want to come and sit at the table for an extended period of time when it's not a happy place to be, when they could be playing or watching TV or being with their friends or doing whatever.
Right.
So one of the first things we can do, and there's a bunch of research behind the psychology of smiling, and that when we do, it actually changes our brain chemistry, right? So when we smile, it actually, it helps bring down that stress level. And so when our kids see that, they might think we're a little bit nuts because they don't see us smile very often. Or think about how often you walk down the street and you see someone smile. You're like, something's wrong with that person.
Totally. That's so funny, because when you mentioned that, this is a little off topic, but it just made me think. I'm a nerd and I read all this stuff too, and I'm very interested in all these things. And so I have this little loop that I jog by our house. Often it's a trail, so there's lots of people on there walking their dogs and whatnot. And I really have done this experiment. Like, I don't collect any data, but I just made this effort to like give a big smile to like everyone that I walk by. And it's like, people are sometimes walking by and I'm sure they're deep in thought and they look kind of grumpy. And then it just brings this like huge smile to their face. And I was like, wow, like I think that just speaks to this sort of like contagiousness of a smile and sort of the way that you can pass on your own positivity, even if it's faked. Like I've said that too. Sometimes you have to fake it till you'll make it. You know what I mean? A little bit where it's like, I'm stressed, but I'm going to put on a happy face. But before you know it, because it doesn't matter how I went into that run, I probably went in like thinking about 8 things I needed to do, and maybe not in the best mood. But by the end of it, I'm like just overjoyed by the like smiles I've gotten back, right? Like every time someone smiles back at me, I get a little bit happier myself. And so I love that. And I also love this concept. So the book that I have coming out in the spring is actually called The Happier Meal, How to Enjoy Your Food and Your Kid. And I think that just hits the heart of it, is that the first step is really like bringing joy to the table and like eliminating the stress from the mealtime, regardless of what you're eating. And I love everything that you're saying in terms of, it's just about several steps, tiny baby steps. It's meeting yourself where you are and getting those little wins that can bring you to that next micro step if it needs to be. And so, I just think your approach is brilliant. I would love to hear I know you kind of said like step 1 can just be smiling at the table. What are some of the other kind of steps that you suggest for families that are just getting into this, like the very first things?
Well, first there's like so many that like come to
Yeah.
What are the ones that I want to share right now? So thinking about removing eating as the goal, right? Mm-hmm. So instead of saying, when I ask parents, what dictates, was this a successful meal for you? They will say yes if their child ate well or tried something new, right? It centers around eating. And they'll say no if they did not eat well or try something new or they fought back on the food or whatnot. But I challenge parents, listening to this, and parents who follow me and so on, to don't just look at what they're eating. Look at all the other steps. Mm-hmm. So are they engaging with foods? Are they, have they touched something they've never touched before? Have they sat at the table a little bit longer? And also, when I teach parents in, my Raising Adventurous Eaters Club, which is a membership that I've been running for 3 years now, what we do, parents want the what, right? They want to know, what kind of food should I put in front of my child? Just 1 second here. I'm going to turn off my. Yes, they want to know, what types of food should I put in front of my child? What kind of recipes can I make? I need a meal plan for my family. Mm-hmm. And instead, what we do in the club, we give them, every month we focus on a food. So like last month, or this coming month, is avocados. Previous month was, spinach, and then there was oranges. And so we're giving parents what they want, but we're also secretly giving them what they need, which is the how. Mm-hmm. And so a couple things. So one thing we're doing this month in terms of the how, what we do actually every month, is exploration. So there's four pillars that I encourage parents to focus on. And I call them the 4 E's to better eating. So enjoyment is one, hence why I'm telling you to smile, right? Because that then creates this just a happier mealtime cycle. 2 is exposure. We got to expose our kids to a variety of foods. And that's why every month in the club, we're encouraging parents to do that and show them how to do it in an engaging way. 3 is exploration, and 4 is expansion, which is what all parents want, is how do I expand my child's food list? And so the piece that is often missing is the exposure and the exploration. And so when I say exposure, I mean getting foods in front of your kids on a regular cadence that isn't necessarily their favorite. So, one thing I would suggest parents do, if you ask your child, what would you like for lunch? What should we have for dinner? Then we are keeping ourselves at stage 1, which we talked about. And if you want to get to point B, then we need to remove that question from our language and our vocabulary. Because when we ask our kids, oh, what would you like for dinner? What are we going to hear? The same foods, right? Over and over again. They're not going to say, hey, mom, I'd actually really like to try some asparagus today. I've never had asparagus, right? They're never going to say, let's have a salad for dinner, right? Unless your kid loves salads. My kids now do love salads, but they're not going to say things like that. They're going to ask for the chicken nuggets or the pasta with no sauce or whatever that favorite food
and in particular, the kids that you're worried about, those are the ones where you're like, I already am worried about the short list of foods that you like to eat. So of course, that child is not going to select.
No, absolutely. Kids are going to take the path of least resistance when it's offered. And so if we open the door to you get to decide what is on the table, then we've just limited our options. So kids need to see new foods to learn to like new foods, right? So that is one piece of the exposure puzzle. And the other thing around exploration, and this is a big piece of what I do, it's why I've created products like, my Curious Cookie cards, right? It's why I've got the Curious Cookie food adventure mat. It's because parents don't know how to make foods fun for their kids without the mess. Because you don't have to explore a new food. It does not mean throwing spaghetti on the wall. It does not mean making a disaster of your table. It means playing with purpose. And so the cards, for instance, what we do is give parents different quick exploration ideas. So what's a quick game that you can play with your kids? So as an example, there's 50 different ideas in this deck, and it's a collaborative game. So now the other piece is actually, Kristin, is that we focus so much on the picky eater and getting them to eat that their anxiety goes up. And when their anxiety goes up, their adrenaline goes up, and then their appetite drops. And so now they're not trying foods. But if we make it a family affair, let's all explore food together, then the focus comes off the child. They can now feel part of the meal. And that is the purpose of the cards, is to get the whole family involved in playing with food with a purpose and getting kids in interacting with food. So as an example, one of the cards might be, okay, try to use a food as a chapstick. So now we're getting a food close to their mouth, right? Or we're getting it close to their face. Another one might be find the food with the biggest smell at the table and find the food with the smallest smell. So these are quick hits of food exploration activities that now families don't have to think about what to say or questions to ask. And so even if you don't have the card, just think about the sensory system and what kind of questions you can ask the family to participate in, so that we're now getting our kids' sensory system primed. Because when you think about it, eating is the only human task that uses all of the senses. Yeah, we tell our kids you can't play with foods. So that is the purpose of exploration.
I love that. And I think that I really like the idea of these products in the sense that it's just sort of like an engaging activity for the family. But in none of those things did you mention anything had to do with, and now we eat this, now you need to eat this, now we, have to eat 3 bites of any of this. It takes the stress off of it. It just becomes like a shared experience rather than, something that I'm required to do. Or I think the biggest thing, a lot of times what causes the stress is this sort of idea of a power struggle that parents and children come to the table with. And, I think that's a lot of times what kind of sucks the joy out of mealtime for everyone is anytime you walk into a scenario where you know that it's like either, I have to do something I don't want to do to make someone else happy, or, you walk in already thinking like I'm not backing down. None of those are a recipe for a pleasant interaction. And so I love this because this is just like, here's a game we're going to play. And I think anything that, even if it's not specifically about the food, sometimes it's just a topic or a game to play or something to make this experience the focus is really just on this being a pleasant, fun, social, communal experience for us as a family. And I think allowing the child to come to the table with that idea, but also allowing the parent, for me at least, I think is also very liberating. When I come and it's like my only job is really to make this like a fun family time. Also, I'm like required by law to provide you food, so here's food. Do you know what I mean? And like kudos even there if I can progress from there and say, and we're gonna add a little more variety, and I've found this cool recipe that I'd like everybody to try, fine. But I think when I make that my first focus, not only does that take the stress off, I'm not like, I need to get him to eat the chicken. Instead it's like, we're just going to play a game. We're going to have fun. Everybody loves that. Yeah. And
well, and what's interesting, but what you said is when, even though, so if you take eating out of the equation and not make it your goal, so you're not saying have a few bites or try this and then you can have this, even that when you focus on the right things, like if you focus on, if you do some of the things that are suggested in the cards and you're doing some of the sensory activities, you're actually, the result ends up being eating in many cases.
Right.
Because you're not focusing on that. You're giving your child a chance to go up those steps that we talked about. And so each of those cards essentially is speaking to one of those steps on that staircase. So you think about the staircase, you want to think about this going up each of the senses, right? Mm-hmm. So can my child tolerate the presence of food? Can my child tolerate the touching the food, smelling the food? Because some kids do not like the smell of foods, and that will smell and taste are connected. So that means if they dislike the way a food smells, they are not putting that food in their mouth. So we need to work ourselves up and work our kids up these mini steps so they also can feel successful, mm-hmm. right? Because if we only acknowledge, when a parent in the membership had mentioned, I was celebrating my child within our first week of the membership, they were eating new foods. And I was like, great job for eating. I'm like, okay, but that's great. But what we need to do is be celebrating the little things they're doing. Like, great job coming to the table today. I love how you sat with me for 5 minutes. Or thank you so much for passing me the bowl without spilling anything. Or, I love how you put that food on your plate. You never done that before. So, and then they can say to themselves, oh, okay, well, mommy and daddy, I can actually make them happy it doesn't have to just be by eating, mm-hmm. right? It can actually be by doing these baby steps, which actually get them to eating faster if we don't push them there, because control is a big piece of the puzzle here. Kids they don't have control over a lot, right. And eating is one of the only things that they can control. So we want to give them a sense of accountability and autonomy at the mm-hmm. table. Let them make their own decisions over what they try, but kind of clear the path for them so it makes it easy to take that next step.
Right. I think what you said talks a lot about just, a lot of it has related to sort of these parenting styles in general. Like, I don't know if you're familiar, but, I've seen like parenting styles kind of broken down into this like authoritarian, permissive, and then this sort of authoritative strategy. So the authoritarian being more like controlling everything. And so to me, those are those people that are like, you'll sit here till you finish your plate, or maybe the very restrictive, like, we don't ever eat sugar, you can never have these foods. Then there's the permissive, which is sort of like living wild and free. Like, my kid just like goes and gets cookies whenever they want. Versus like what they would call like an authoritative parenting style, and that being more just like you said. So there's a certain like guardrails that you maybe put up as a parent to say, this is the structure we use. This is where we sit when we eat. I decide what we eat with your input because I care about you and I, respect your opinion. So I know you love this, so that's going to remain in the rotation. And that these are the times we eat. We don't maybe just like eat all day. But at the same time, giving that child that sense of autonomy to make decisions within that sort of guardrails or those frameworks. And if you look, it's really that authoritative parenting style where we see kids able to develop healthy eating habits, healthier relationships with their body. And it's really the only strategy in the long term, I think, that works that way. And so I think that you hit the nail on the head when you said, what's amazing is when you focus on the how, really being kind of the style that you approach all of this with, that has nothing to do in the first place with what you're putting on the table. The other elements, the what, kind of naturally improve. So when they begin to self-regulate and be open to eating new foods, the variety and the exploration and the willingness to be a more adventurous eater, the willingness to listen to their own body's cues, that all kind of naturally flows from that sort of approach to feeding. So I think that that's amazing. So I really love these strategies that you have. If people are interested, I think that the tools that you provide with parents through your coaching, and then also, like you said, these cards and your placemats, if they want to get a hold of some of these things or feel like this is really resonating with me, this is what I need in my life, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah. So generally DanielleBinns.com. So BINNS, is my website. So you'll find, my blog there, and just some resources, and got a number of like freebies you can download just if you're just needing little nuggets of support. The Balanced Lunchbox actually is a really great tool that parents are loving right now, because if you're wondering, how do I create a lunch that my kids that's actually going to fuel them for the day? There's over 60 ideas in there. So definitely grab that freebie. And I can give you the link to that, Kristin, if it's helpful.
You bet.
So, and then for a lot of parents want to work with me, but working one-on-one is maybe not, people don't have the time or the resources and whatnot. So I wanted to make it easier for families to have wins at the table. And so to your earlier question about the Curious Cookie products, there's the Mealtime Fun Cards, the Food Adventure Mat, which is both have been a huge success in terms of getting kids to try rejected foods a lot faster, even your pickiest eaters. So you can find us at CuriousCookieKids.com, and then on Instagram at Danielle Binns Nutrition and Curious Cookie Kids as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Those are excellent resources. I'm sure just about every parent can find something in there that they'll find super useful. So thank you so much for joining us and for the amazing work that you're doing.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and congrats on your book. I can't wait to see and grab it when it comes out. No, it's been a fun chat, Kristin. Thank you
too. Thanks. Bye-bye. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Feeding the Family. We would love your help in getting the word out about our podcast so that we can help more families. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe or follow button, and we'll see you here next week.